There are 7 billion human beings on planet Earth right now as we speak. That's an insane number. I mean, try to get your head around that. 7 billion people. Now, you want an even crazier number. How many people have ever existed in the entirety of human existence? We don't even know what that number is. I mean, maybe it's trillions. Who knows? I can't even make a guess. But one of the problems that comes along with that is the question of who is worthy of studying, who is worthy of emulating, and whose mistakes should we be learning from. But more on that in a moment. Hello friends, my name is Michael McCauley and you are listening to Our Dark History, where we discuss the darkest people, places, and events in human history. Today, we are going to be discussing the significance of Leon Trotsky because even though he existed in one of the craziest times ever, I think that he has played such a significant role in impacting modern politics and the history of the 20th century that, he's just such a crazy guy. We really should be studying what he did, why he did it, who he was. And I'm currently working on a Biocast episode about his life, so be ready for that. Be sure to follow Biocast because that is going to be such a good episode. But without any further ado, let's get right on into the episode. One of the most important things Trotsky did during his life was spread internationalism across the world. Now, you could see this as a positive or a negative, but he really was responsible for spreading propaganda everywhere. I mean, this guy really dedicated his life to spreading the idea of Marxism, communism, equality, all the things that he fought for, that he believed in. Like, he's the reason that there still are communists and these different organizations across the Western world, because they probably would not have been created if it had not been for, his work as a propagandist. And on top of spreading the propaganda to all these Western nations to begin with, he also kind of stood as like a symbol of, he was the good one, right? Because everyone kind of looked, and anyone that was honest about it saw that Stalin was a really bad guy. The USSR was a complete dumpster fire of what it was supposed to be. And all these people that were like, yeah, Trotsky, communism, they kind of pointed to him and they were like, if he had been put in charge of the USSR, things would have been good. So he just really spread this propaganda far and wide. And one of the things that's actually really cool about him is that he's been to like just about every major capital of the world. Paris, London, he was in New York City, which is so cool. I think it's so nice when I can research someone historically and they actually went to America for a little while. And it's like, oh my God, finally, us Americans have a connection to someone important. Because sometimes it doesn't feel like we have all that many people that, have that historical significance, right? There's those two oceans were really good to stop people from invading us, but really bad because they stopped important people from coming here, unfortunately. And the other big thing that he did was, as he was spreading Marxism, he really was one of the people that encouraged Bavarian socialism. And this is important because it led to the rise of Hitler. So when the USSR first became established after the Civil War in Russia, what they did was they really wanted to push for the communist revolution to happen in the places that really mattered. They acknowledged that Russia was like this backward country that didn't really have a lot of power. It had a lot of manpower, but it was like, so what? It just wasn't that important on the world stage. It wasn't a great power. It wasn't a France or a Britain or a Germany. Now, Germany was the big seat of industrialization. It was one of the most industrial nations at the time. And the real goal of the Marxists was to spread internationalism and communism to the most developed country they could. That was the goal. And when they did this, when they encouraged all this revolution, they didn't get all of Germany, but they got Bavaria. And Bavaria was, for a little while after World War I, an independent nation state. But there was some backlash there, because what ended up happening was you had a reaction. And that reaction gave rise to like all of these right-wing extremist groups. Because all the people living in Bavaria at the time, they hated communism. They saw the horrors and the censorship and the starvation. There are so many horrible things that go on in communism. And when you don't live under it, it's kind of hard to appreciate how difficult it really is. Once you've spent some time, once you've had maybe a year or two of living under a communist dictatorship, that's when you can really start to appreciate how miserable it is, how important it is to be an anti-communist. However, a lot of people at the time fell into the typical, if people are going to go far to the left, I'm just going to go far to the right in reaction. So when the Nazi Party was first rising, Hitler and, his people, him and the Nazis, they were just like nobodies. Everyone was a right-wing extremist in Bavaria at the time. Anyone that mattered, because they were all a reaction of the Bavarian communist dictatorship. And without Trotsky, that Bavarian socialist state probably wouldn't have happened. So because of Trotsky, Hitler and the Nazis came to power. Now, it doesn't, of course, there are a gazillion little things that happen in between, and there's no way he could have known that. But it is something that he indirectly played a really big role in helping along. Now, you have to wonder, there were a bunch of other right-wing extremist groups. The other big faction was the fascists. And Hitler was different because he put the ethno-nationalism idea on top of fascism. And other fascists were just like, we're about state control and right-wing authoritarianism. We don't care what your race is. And Hitler was, he was the ethno-nationalist fascist, the Nazis. So it's just really interesting to see, because you have to wonder, what would have happened if Bavaria had just been able to not suffer through communism? Maybe they would have been able to not have a Nazi party ever. It could have happened. And you really have to wonder, what would have happened? Maybe things would have turned out a little bit better. Maybe World War II could have been prevented. So it's one of those historical what-ifs that you couldn't have guessed it going forward. But looking back, if Trotsky had not been such a proponent of spreading communism to Germany, there may not have been a Hitler. Now, there may have been, you can always say, there definitely would have been a Hitler anyway. Maybe. You can make an argument, but anyway. He was also really important because he developed important ideas. Trotsky was a thinker. He believed in really sitting down and romanticizing things and theorizing. And it's actually really interesting because as I've studied his life now, you really begin to see he was as much of a pragmatist as he was an idealist. And that's a really cool combination to have, because not only is he the kind of guy that's that will change his entire ideology based on, hey, this works and this doesn't work. I'm going to drop what doesn't work and I'm going to start doing more of what works. It's really cool to see someone that can do that, but also be as ideological as he was. Because normally you see someone that's one end of the extreme or the other. You very rarely see someone that is pragmatic and lives up to the ideal. If you look at Joseph Stalin, I don't think he really cared about communism. He didn't really care about anything. He just wanted power for himself. And I think Marx and Engels and Bolshevism, anything else, they were secondary. They were tools to power. They were an ends to the means. If he had lived in a fascist state, Stalin probably would have been yeah, why not? I'll be a fascist too. Just whatever gets me in power, man. As long as I can be the fascist, that's okay. But Trotsky's different. Trotsky, I don't think he would accept power under a fascist state or anything that wasn't his ideal. And, of course, we now know with hindsight that communism, not such a good idea in practice, but I think it's something that can be praised in Trotsky. And one of the big ideas he developed was communist militarism, because leading into this point in history, there was a big division between the military and the working class people. The working class people, they were like, yeah, the military, they just want to get us in there. They want us to get strong and to fight a war for something that we don't believe in, to make money for someone who controls our government without our loyalty or without our acceptance. And it was just an all-around bad thing. There was a big division between the communists and the military. Because also, what do you know? The people in the military are not very left-wing. And this is something that's historically been true. They tend to lean to the right. We can talk more about that another time, but that's just a general tendency. And you can see that even today, right? People tend to lean to the right in the military. There are exceptions, of course, but generally as a trend, they lean to the right. And it caused this big division between the military and the communists early on. Now, Trotsky's important because he became like the Secretary of War, or what we would today call the Secretary of Defense. And he was the one that really made communist militarism a possible thing, a viable option. Because, when he got into power, when they finally got their communist state, they realized early on, they were like, oh, what do you know? You need a military to run a state. This is a necessary function in the government. And if you don't have it, there's just going to be another revolution. Anyone with a gun can take over. So it just didn't really, this was something that was desperately needed. And because of Trotsky's unique position as both an ideological communist and thinker, he was able to really make the most of his role in the government as commander of the military. Now, it's always important to acknowledge he never really served in the military. He commanded the military, never fought in it. That's one of those inconsistencies that only a real communist can have, I guess. But, he was a war correspondent during the Balkan Wars, but, being a war journalist isn't the same as holding a gun in your hand and shooting someone. Especially at this point where, the wars were getting horrible. PTSD and shell shock. It's just crazy times. Crazy times for that. And never having gone through it, I think that kind of plays a role. Another really important idea that he developed was this idea of the united front. The idea that any communist, any working class person, there's camaraderie between them. It doesn't matter if you're an American communist, it doesn't matter if you're a Russian or German or from anywhere else. We're all comrades, we're all working class together. And that was a really important idea. Really important because it changes the way communism spreads itself going forward. It's not so much like this, what the Soviet Union had, because they were very much, Stalin kind of perverted the idea of the United Front in a lot of ways in practice, but when people were ideological about it, they could really cling to this idea of the United Front and be like, we are going to liberate the working class from the bourgeoisie, like they wanted to see. If you were a French communist, you wanted communism in Germany as much as you wanted it in France, because it was going to be good for the working class comrades over there. You were the same as the German working class, or the British, or the Russian, or American, or whatever else. So this was really important. And it really impacted the domino theory, because the idea of domino theory was that, communism is just going to spread everywhere. It sounds good in practice. People get caught by the contagion, and then a communist dictatorship pops up, and then you lose control of that part of the world. It's just gone. Like there's, up until that point, there were very few examples of a successful anti-communist revolution. People weren't sure that it was going to happen. So it was just really, really a crazy thing to see. And seeing communism spread, seeing the camaraderie between the idealistic people who wanted communism, it kind of created a fear, right? I mean, in America, we know about the Red Fear. Everyone thought communism was coming and it's going to spread across the world and envelop the entire planet. I think they overestimated communism a little bit. And I can't really blame them because, at the time, you didn't know. If you were alive during that time, you just didn't know, right? Let's just be honest about it. But I think it really speaks volumes of how effective this united front thing really was. People uniting. I mean, it's something that is as nice sounding as it is pragmatic. Because, the communists were more effective at spreading communism when they were united with their other working class comrades. It was way more likely that there was going to be a revolution somewhere in Central Europe after the Soviet Union. Like, it was just more likely to happen. Why? Because now the communists have control of Russia. They're going to be able to get control in other places, and they're going to just have more resources to pour into creating revolution. And then, again, it's one of those things where success begets success. One revolution makes it more likely that another revolution is going to come, and another, and another. And so, you can kind of see how domino theory thinkers, really saw things. They weren't crazy for thinking this. They really weren't. Now, another big idea that Trotsky developed. The entire concept of permanent revolution. The idea that we need to continuously spread revolution everywhere in the world, and we can't stop until everywhere is communist. Now, it kind of goes hand in hand with the United Front. But here's the tricky part about it. Permanent revolution by itself really just means we need more revolution all the time. Every resource, every person, every dollar that we have should be used to bring more revolution in as many places as we can. And I think these two ideas go really well together because on top of having the united front of people working together in camaraderie, you also have this idea that we need to not stop. You can't stop the revolution because it's just going to happen everywhere. That's how it needs to be. So, yeah, again, this is another one of those ideas that kind of got thrown out the window when Stalin took power. He didn't really care about permanent revolution. Like, if he could spread another communist dictatorship to, somewhere else in the world, he was all for it because it probably meant more power and money for him. But, in the grand scheme of things, he was just like, yeah, let's consolidate our gains. And there were a lot of other Bolshevik thinkers that really wanted to consolidate things in Russia before anything major happened. Because they realized how shaky it really was. It's one thing to be a communist thinker. It's a very different thing to be a communist running the government. Very different extremes. So the other reason Trotsky is really important is because he symbolizes the disappointment of honest communists. It's no secret that the USSR was a complete failure in every single way. It was supposed to be a country that was a champion of human rights. Well, it was the worst abuser of human rights ever. It was supposed to liberate the working class people. It enslaved the working class people. All of the ideals were destroyed. And Trotsky he never directly says, "Oh man, we done goofed. It was all for nothing." He never says anything like that. Even in his memoir, as he, kind of knew his life was coming to an end, he talks about how even in death, he doesn't regret anything. He doesn't regret having been a Marxist, a revolutionary. He would have done it all again. He's like, yeah, I would have changed some smaller things, but the big idea, the idea of being a Marxist and a comrade of the working class, yeah, that was all good. However, he did express his disappointment in the USSR. And there are a lot of people that were sympathizers. I mean, even there was H.G. Wells, Bertrand Russell, and a whole bunch of other thinkers across the Western world that were like, yes, socialism, finally, let's bring about some of these good ideas. And they were just completely disappointed when they saw what happened in practice. It was really disappointing. I mean, you got something that's like the utopia, and then it's a dystopia. It really makes you realize that sometimes ideas can sound good and really not be. Really not be. And Trotsky was kind of an embodiment of that sentiment, that all of the comrades who worked so tirelessly, and all of it was for nothing, because what did they bring about? Like this horrible thing that was like a complete monstrosity that killed millions of people and did just horrible stuff. I mean, people always talk about the deaths, and those are bad. But you got to think about how many lives were ruined. I mean, there are some people that, somewhere around 100 million deaths as a result of communism. Those are just the deaths. That doesn't include people who lost family members, who were completely broken, children that were left without parents who lost their children. Some crazy stuff. It's crazy to think about. It really is. It really is. And Trotsky is just this guy that's like, it was supposed to be better than it is. Stalin ruined everything. But, if you look at Trotsky's history, he was just as guilty of genocide as Joseph Stalin was. Just as guilty. But that doesn't stop modern communists from kind of, Trotsky was this really great guy, and he wouldn't have genocided everyone like Stalin did. Newsflash, he did. Especially when he was commander of the military. But we can talk more about that in the Biocast episode. But that's going to be it for the episode. I really hope you guys enjoyed this. I hope you guys understand some of the really important stuff that Trotsky was responsible for, some of the changes that he brought about, not only in Russia, not only in Europe, but all across the world. He was one of these revolutionary figures that it just sheds so much light on ideas, how those ideas are brought about, implemented, and he's just such a fascinating guy. So I really hope you guys are excited for the Biocast episode about his life. It's going to be amazing. If it's out, I'm going to have a link to it in the description or the show notes, so be sure to check for that if you're watching at a later time. But that's going to be it for the episode. I really hope you guys enjoyed. Be sure to follow the show wherever it is you're listening. Thank you so much, and I will see you in the next one. Peace out.